All right, today we're jumping into a concept that is no exaggeration, at the very heart of one of the biggest splits in Christian history, Sola Scriptura. And this was a foundational principle of the Protestant Reformation, but it is still a major point of debate today. It's really just a single Latin phrase that sparked a revolution, and to understand it, we've got to start with a central question it forces everyone to answer.
Really, the whole thing comes down to this one powerful question. Is the Bible the sole, the infallible, the sufficient rule for a Christian's faith and practice? Or are there other authorities, like tradition or the church itself, that are just as essential? That's what we're going to unpack.
So what exactly is Sola Scriptura? Well, the term is Latin, and it just means scripture alone. It's the idea, which really got formalized back in the 16th century Reformation, that the Bible is the one and only infallible source of authority for Christians. If you're going to believe it, you've got to be able to prove it from the pages of the Bible. Simple as that.
Now here's where it gets really fascinating. Both sides of this massive argument go to the very same book to prove their point. Proponents say, hey, Scripture claims its own sufficiency, while critics argue that those exact same verses are being totally misinterpreted. So let's look at the key passages at the center of the fight.
Okay, so this right here, this is probably the #1 most cited verse in the whole debate. And the argument for Sola Scriptura seems pretty straightforward. If Scripture can make a person complete and equipped for every good work, I mean, what else could you possibly need? It sounds like a slam-dunk case for self-sufficiency.
But this is where the fireworks really start. Critics push back, and they push back hard. First, they say the word profitable is not the same as sufficient. A hammer is profitable for building a house, but you're going to need more than just a hammer. Second, and this is a huge historical point, the scripture that Paul was actually talking about here, it was only the Old Testament. The New Testament wasn't even fully written yet. And that leads to this killer question that just hangs over this whole thing. How do we even know which books are supposed to be in the Bible in the first place? That decision had to be made by an authority outside the Bible.
All right, next up for the Sola Scriptura case, we have the example of the Bereans. They're often held up as this perfect model for all believers. See, they heard the Apostle Paul preach, but they didn't just take his word for it. No, they went home and checked the scriptures themselves to see if what he was saying was true.
So on the surface, the argument is simple, right? They use Scripture as the ultimate fact-checker. But the rebuttal says, hold on, let's look at the whole picture here. Just because you examine Scripture doesn't automatically mean it's the only authority. And if you look closely at the verse, it also says they eagerly received Paul's oral teaching. So it seems like they valued both his spoken words and the written ones, side by side.
Now this one feels like a potential knockout punch for the Sola Scriptura side. It's a direct command from the Apostle Paul himself. Do not go beyond what is written. I mean, how much clearer can you get, right?
Well, maybe not so clear after all. The rebuttal here is pretty interesting. First, scholars will tell you this phrase is notoriously tricky to translate. Its exact meaning is really debated. Second, it seems to contradict Paul himself, who in another letter actually commands believers to hold to traditions taught by word of mouth. And maybe the biggest tell? Even a giant of the Reformation like John Calvin didn't use this verse to argue for Scripture alone.
So, as you can see, the biblical case for Scripture alone might not be as airtight as it first seems. But the debate doesn't stop there. Now we're going to flip the script a bit. We're moving from defending against these verses to looking at the proactive case for tradition, based on history and the Bible's own words.
And here's the ironic twist. Critics of Sola Scriptura argue that the Bible itself points to another co-equal authority, tradition. You have passages like 2 Thessalonians 2:15 that explicitly tell believers to hold on to traditions passed down by word of mouth right alongside those passed down in writing. The Bible itself, they argue, endorses both.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the timeline, because this puts the whole thing in perspective. For decades, even centuries, the early church grew and thrived without a complete New Testament. The faith was passed on orally. The final official list of books, the canon, wasn't settled until the end of the 4th century. And the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, as a formal idea, it doesn't show up for another 1,200 years. So from this point of view, critics say, hey, this isn't some timeless doctrine. It's a much more recent invention.
And it's not just a modern argument. You can find this idea way back with some of Christianity's heaviest hitters.
Here's St. Augustine, writing right around the time the Bible's contents were being finalized, making a really powerful statement about the authority of the church being essential to his belief in the gospel itself.
Which leads us to what might be the biggest logical puzzle for Sola Scriptura. Seriously, think about this for a second. The Bible doesn't come with a divinely inspired table of contents. So, how do we know which books are supposed to be in there?
And that's the thing. That list of books, what we call the canon, it wasn't decided by Scripture. It was decided by people, by early church councils, based on their tradition. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem for this Scripture alone view. You first need a non-biblical authority to tell you what the Bible even is.
Okay, so we've talked theology, we've talked history, but what about the real world? What actually happens, according to critics, when you make every individual their own final authority on what the Bible means?
Check out this number. Over 30,000. That's the estimated number of distinct Christian denominations in the world today, so many with conflicting beliefs. And critics of Sola Scriptura point to this number and say, see, this is the result, doctrinal chaos.
And listen, we're not talking about small disagreements here. These are foundational, core beliefs. Things like, how are you saved? What is happening during communion? Do you baptize babies or not? Churches that all claim to follow the Bible alone have reached completely opposite conclusions on these massive issues.
The author of our source material shares this anecdote from a student, and it really gets to the heart of the practical problem. If there's no final, authoritative interpreter and we're all reading the same book, why is your sincere interpretation any better than mine?
And so, after looking at the biblical arguments, the historical context, and the real-world impact, it all comes spiraling back to where we started, to that one central, unanswered question about authority.
And there it is, the core paradox of the whole debate. If the Bible is the final word, who gets the final say on what that word means? Is it the individual believer, the community, an established church? It's the question that has defined Christian history for the last 500 years and continues to shape it today.